Our session for this morning is session 3. It will be started by a lecture by Dr. Claudia Sahm on forecasting future crises. The session will be chaired by Dr. Maria Almasara Cid and Tuaño-Amador. She is the Deputy Governor in charge of the Corporate Services Sector and the BSP Research Academy of the BSP. Ma'am, you have the virtual floor.
A very good morning to our participants in Asia and a good day to our speaker, discussant, and our participants elsewhere. This is session 3 of the 2021 Reinventing Bretton Woods Conference, which is being jointly hosted by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas with the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee. The session is on forecasting future crises. For this lecture session, we have one speaker and one discussant, which gives us plenty of time to have a more detailed and substantive discussion, as well as take on more questions from our participants. Our speaker is Claudia Sahm, who is a senior fellow at the Jain Family Institute, the founder of Stay at Home Macro Consulting, and a regular contributor at Bloomberg Opinion. She has worked with the Federal Reserve and the Council of Economic Advisors. She is known for her eponymously titled Sahm Rule, which supports an automatic trigger for stimulus payments in recessions. Our discussant is Dr. Roberto Mariano, who is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania and was the founding Dean of the School of Economics at the Singapore Management University. He's a member of the Bangko Central's Research Expert Panel, which is the international advisory body for the Bangko Central's research program. By way of an introduction to the presentation, Sandra Plianalto, former president and chief executive officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, said that as a member of the FOMC, she's often asked about the FRB Cleveland's economic outlook, but she's often less asked about how they arrived at that outlook. I also read about how the Queen of England visited the London School of Economics in November 2008, a couple of months after the failure of Lehman Brothers, and how she asked the simple question of, why didn't anybody notice? Economists continue to grapple with the challenge of forecasting in uncertain times. More so of late, because it has been said that the ability of existing models to predict systemic crises out of sample is still quite limited, including because the proximate cause of crisis can be and is currently non-economic in origin and has no close parallel to previous events. Far from giving the illusion of control over the future, forecasting nonetheless provides an organized way to examine the economic outlook and policy options with a view to reaching policy decisions while being mindful of the limitations of forecasting accuracy due to uncertainty. Increasingly, advances in data science mean that there are additional tools such as AI and machine learning algorithms that have been integrated into the conventional methods of forecasting that typically depend on available official data. These techniques allow the use of high-frequency indicators of economic activity that promise to improve upon the forecasting performance of models over time. They also offer the possibility of more granularity and dynamic ways to better harness data, models, and thought processes to signal inflection or turning points, well before more conventional indicators become available, leading to timelier and hopefully more robust policy decisions. For this session, we consider one such example of real-time tracking of recession. For the flow of this 1-hour session, we will have the presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by the reaction of our discussant, and then we open the floor for questions. We now call on Claudia to give her presentation on forecasting future recessions. Claudia, please.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I think, as was said, this is an important topic. How should we think about forecasting future recessions? What tools do we have in the toolbox? What ones do we need to add? And I bring to this a perspective of, I was a forecaster at the Federal Reserve for over a decade, starting in 2008. So I know exactly that feeling of the models we have are not enough, and learned along the way some of the extra tools that are used at the Fed and increasingly elsewhere to think about recessions and forecasting them. Okay, so I have 3 key takeaways for the talk. One, and this has to do with our historical tools. We do need to be very careful when we rely on statistical relationships. Yield curve inversion is just one of the tools that we've used in the past, and those show up in other models. Those relationships can change. And something really important is they don't tell us what is driving us into a recession, right? I'm not saying we don't want these tools, they're not a complete set. And so one area that has seen a lot of development is in the real-time tracking of economic and financial conditions. So we have so much more data than we had before. It's often very rich and can help us tell a story. Now, it's often this now casting what's happening right now. And I'll talk about that some more. And then the last piece, and this is a part in the policy response, we need to be humble, and we are, but I mean, the tools we have for forecasting are not sufficient to give us enough of a head start to let policymakers have enough time to react. So the best thing we can do is prepare ahead of time for a recession, have really good indicators of when it started, and start policy. So this preparation is important. Okay, so as I said before, we need to be real about the flaws and the potential limitations of our past tools. This runs the gamut. This is not about dynamic general stochastic equilibrium models are bad or yield curve. This is just broadly speaking, it's very hard to know which tools and which relationships will hold up. And this is particularly important. We think there are all kinds of recessions. We are no longer in the world where our recessions are repeatedly caused by central banks raising rates too soon. Okay, so it's important to have flexible tools. This is just one example looking at the yield curve. We are in a world where interest rates have been falling. Term premiums are not stable in a just structural way. They've been declining. Then you put recessions on top of it. And frankly, we have, with quantitative easing, with unconventional monetary tools, central banks are much more active in asset markets. So we just have to be really careful that we have tools that are up to a changing world. And then when we think about the forecasting, and in particular thinking about risk scenarios, which is a really important part of forecasting, it's really clear that the best among us struggle to be able to envision like how bad in a turning point things could be. So this is just an example taken from the staff's forecast at the Federal Reserve in August of 2007. So this was about a year before the financial crisis hit. It was clear that house prices were declining. That chart on the left is what went to the Federal Open Market Committee members before their meeting that summer. And what you can see is the absolute worst case scenario that they ran was far more sanguine than what happened in the world. And this is not just the tools used at the Fed, it's just really hard to work through the events that we haven't seen before, and particularly the interactions. So we should keep doing forecasting, we should keep doing risk scenarios, but we can't stop there. And frankly, we need to think of like really different kinds of tools. Okay, so this, and I mean, I'm doing a bit of a pivot here, right? Moving from forecasting as the way we approach this problem to tracking. So in real time, very timely. So not waiting 3 months, 6 months to get good data, but like waiting 2 days, right? So we want to be able to watch what's happening in the economy in real time. We may use statistical models, we may use machine learning to do the patterns, but it's really about what's happening right now. And I will say for any of us that do professional forecasting, there is a lot of uncertainty often about what's happening at the moment, and all forecasts are very much conditioned on where you start them. So this idea of nowcasting and tracking, has a a long history in this kind of macroeconomic analysis. And what I'll argue is, while forecasts are very imprecise, sometimes they might suggest a recession is coming, won't tell us when exactly, won't tell us why. Tracking has the potential to give us a lot of confidence that we're in a recession and now is the time to respond. And they can give us a real richness about what is exactly happening during the recession, and forecasting through the recovery is very important too. All right, so I'm going to give 3 examples of ways that we've seen these kind of big data, these real-time data being used, like at the Federal Reserve and then some in this crisis. So again, the idea here is to track and not forecast, right? So the example here are 2 major hurricanes that were in the United States now several years ago. So Hurricane Ira and Harvey, or Irma, sorry, this typo, Irma and Harvey. And this was a data series that I and a group of economists at the Federal Reserve over several years created, that was a daily, geographically detailed retail sales measures that were based on payment processing data. So it's from a big private company. And we had these data series constructed. So within 2 days, we had the next estimates of daily spending. What this allowed us to do is to watch directly the effects of these 2 hurricanes on spending. And what you can see here is, in both cases, Harvey and Irma, the hurricane arrives, spending plummets. But there are different features of the two hurricanes, whether there's evacuation orders, whether the power went out. And so instead of trying to use a historical relationship of this is what happens to spending to GDP in hurricanes, we could just track it. And so that was and that was able to give us a lot of richness and a lot of specifics about what was happening. So that's a very different approach. Again, a hurricane is a very, it's not a recession in that it lasts a long time, but it does have this very strong response when it occurs. Okay, so a second one that's very much related to the current crisis. We knew as soon as the pandemic started, we understood what the threat was and the economy shutting down to keep us safe, that it was going to be in the face-to-face service sectors where we saw a particular slowdown in activity. Some of that was just to keep us safe, but as we knew that that was important, it opens up this, well, we have big data that's very specific to the service sector, right? And that can allow us to do tracking. And I mean, this one, we knew we were in the recession very quickly, but the open table data, which is restaurant bookings, is an example of how, like, we're in like a slower moving phase of this cycle, but there are a lot of questions right now about the Delta variant. What does that do to the recovery in the United States? How much does this change the spending, the rebound in services? And what you can see is towards the end of this series, and again, these data are updated on a daily basis, we do start to see at the same time that the Delta variant is here, of pulling back in these restaurant reservations, which are a measure of the spending. And in fact, not too much after this, we got a jobs report in the United States that showed, in fact, spending was weakening. So you can imagine measures like this, and there are many different ones, where you can monitor always, like for small fluctuations in activity, and then also potentially see big changes in activity with recessions. And the other thing that these tracking data, because they are granular in terms of what you're looking at, so this is restaurants, you can have a better sense of what it is that is going on in the economy. When we do forecasting, and this was very much the way we thought about it at the Federal Reserve, it's storytelling to some extent. We do need statistical models. We do write down numbers, But at the end of the day, what policymakers really need to understand is why. Why are we getting these forecasts? How does this make sense? And the why is very important because when the world changes, when the data come in differently, we know what assumptions, or we can really think about, well, what are the assumptions about the world that we made that got us the forecast? That's much harder to do if you just have a statistical model that's pushing out numbers. So there's a benefit to getting into the details. By looking at very granular data, whether it's high frequency, whether it's sector specific. Now, there's the challenge of rolling it all up together, but I do think this is an important addition to a forecaster's toolkit. And then another piece, and this is very important for the storytelling, it is important for policymakers, is it has been very beneficial in this crisis, which frankly is the first recession and recovery that we have had in the United States where we had access to so much of this granular, uh, big data. And it's really improved the quality of information that policymakers have in the moment. And this is yet another example of a big data set. This one is by the JP Morgan Chase Institute, and it's using the bank transaction data, so the checkings, the savings accounts. They can look at inflows and outflows, and the work that they have done in conjunction with academics has been really important in terms of asking and answering nearly in real time some important policy questions. What this one is looking at is the effects of the unemployment benefits in the United States, the extra payments when they roll off, which has important effects on the labor market, the labor shortage question in the U.S. So this is the kind of work that has been really hard to do in the past, and it is extremely helpful to policymakers, right? It's not just about knowing the recession is coming. There is a whole, like the forecast, I mean, the Federal Reserve is always doing a forecast. Yes, it is important to know a recession is coming. If you can do that, it's extremely important for you to know how severe is it? What are the dynamics? What does the recovery look like? And to understand that, it's an important, like there are big policy responses that happen in a recession. In the United States, there was $5 trillion of fiscal spending and trillions of dollars of Federal Reserve efforts pumping money into financial markets. We need to be able to understand those effects and effects in real time. Every crisis is different. This pandemic was absolutely something that we don't have historical precedent, something that would really challenge forecasting models. So again, I'm just emphasizing the benefits of these new kinds of data and how they can be used in conjunction with others, statistical forecasting models that we've used in the past. And the last piece, and this is again to make a case for monitoring current conditions so carefully and what it means if we are humble about the fact that we're just we're never going to have the crystal ball. We're never going to have the forecast models that tell us everything we need to know to fight the recession before it starts. So with these tracking data, we have the potential, if we have a reliable way to know we are in a recession, that can be the time to start the monetary policy, start the fiscal policy. Particularly with the fiscal policy, it would be very helpful to have the frontline response in terms of policy, whether it's stimulus checks or extra jobless benefits, have that on autopilot. So the economic conditions that we all track so carefully, that they can be what turns on the extra stimulus, because it's not like we are trying to, and this session is about forecasting recessions, but at the end of the day, we forecast them so we can fight them, right? And so this is just a point that we can use the data, use our insights about the economy to help policymakers go at the recession as quickly as possible and and make it less severe and the recovery shorter. So the whole idea of this is what's called automatic stabilizers. You put policy on autopilot and you tie it to economic conditions. That's again when it starts and when it stops. We've seen in this crisis in the United States a lot of debate about how long policy intervention should go. And then it's all political drama as to whether they get extended or they expire. And frankly, there are other things that policymakers could be working on in this crisis instead of arguing over the policies they always do. And frankly, we've learned enough with data. We've learned enough with how the economy behaves in recessions. Like this is, recessions are a unique phenomenon. We do need to understand them as different from other times in the economy. What this chart is showing is a recession indicator that I developed. This is what's referred to as the Sahm rule. Very small increases, at least in the United States, right? This is not some kind of, natural law or something, but in the United States, very small increase, a 0.5 percentage point, we're in a recession. This is based on labor market data. This is not something that outside people can manipulate or change. And it has the potential to be able to say, let's start policy. Again, this is just listening to the economy and building policy around it. And then lastly, this is where, we are talking about forecasting in terms of like when is a recession, when's it coming? I think another big contribution that economists who are thinking in this, like what's coming next, is it emphasizes there's a preparation in the policy space that we should be informing as well. In this crisis, particularly in the United States, the fiscal response was very forceful. And yet one can easily look at the policies, even policies that are good. I have research that stimulus checks, they worked, they were relief, they supported spending. They also didn't make, like, the timing, the amounts, like it didn't make sense with the economic conditions. Things were really backloaded. There were big gaps between checks. So this is where thinking about policy ahead of time, thinking about how economic conditions look typically in recessions and recoveries, we can do such a better job preparing ahead of time. So that was, I think that's just important for us to think beyond, what's the great model that we can have for forecasting. We should absolutely keep working on that. There's a long body of research and experience, but we need to think more broadly about the task at hand, which is fighting the recession. And that goes well beyond the statistical models or even the data that we have that we can bring to bear. So that is my prepared. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that very insightful and pragmatic presentation, if I can say so. Now we will invite Dr. Mariano to offer his comments and thoughts on your presentation. Dr. Mariano, please.
Thank you very much, Sid. First of all, I'd like to thank the BSP organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this session. As the title suggests, Dr. Sahm is espousing a shift to real-time tracking and to automatic stabilizers in forecasting future recessions. Indeed, a timely, appropriate topic for consideration in this BSP conference, as the Philippines and the whole world continue to cope with COVID-19. There have been so many scholarly developments related to this topic for many years now, and new research fronts continue to emerge at an even more dizzying pace nowadays. My comments today are based on my reading of the presentation slides and my interpretation of real-time tracking in terms of nowcasting with higher and higher frequency data. In digesting Dr. Sam's material, I realized that the main question to sort out is not so much yes or no to her chief proposition, I am in general agreement with it, but rather what? What does the phrase real-time tracking mean concretely? What specific data and indicators would be used? What models to develop for the analysis? What statistical techniques to employ for model estimation, validation, subsequent use for nowcasting and policy analysis? My main takeaway from this discussion would be to see a great deal of complementarity between real-time tracking and innovations in modern data science, statistical and econometric techniques. These advances offer powerful tools for taking advantage of up-to-date information and new non-standard data to effectively provide an analytical tool for policymakers, and, quoting the organizer's description of this session, to take preemptive actions against an impending crisis to mitigate economic fallout. Furthermore, a new generation of crisis prediction models may need to be developed to account for the unusual circumstances surrounding the current situation: pandemic, global supply chain disruptions, evolving labor market behavior and financial market features, and so on. My discussion today thinks of real-time tracking for crisis prediction in the context of nowcasting future recessions with some statistical methodology using relevant high-frequency data or indicators. These indicators would include less standard information, such as from business and consumer expectation surveys, big data, news count measures, etc., as Dr. Sahm also points out in her presentation. For any country like the Philippines, this data should also include relevant political and institutional realities, in addition to the standard economic and financial indicators. And most likely, the data would also be at mixed frequencies. Dr. Sahm points out in her slides that historical statistical relationships are not reliable, that econometric modeling approaches have performed below par in predicting recessions, and that it is time for new tools and real-time tracking of a wide range of economic financial indicators. Yes, existing econometric models and assumptions indeed need further enhancements, especially in the face of a pandemic, but it does not necessarily imply that econometric models should be ignored altogether. With appropriate enhancements and more painstaking validation, they will continue to serve as an explicit organized structure for real-time tracking and policy analysis. And there are opportunities and avenues for doing this, thanks to the advances in econometric methods and data science, especially for mixed frequency forecasting, forecast evaluation, policy analysis under pandemic shocks, and artificial intelligence and machine learning tools for robust and real-time forecasting. To my limited knowledge, various research units in BSP are currently undertaking research projects along these lines. For example, using financial conditions and labor market conditions indices, expectations, and news count data in their forecasting and nowcasting of inflation and real GDP growth in the Philippines. Various papers in the literature document the finding that different mixtures of real and financial variables work best at different horizons, suggesting the need to maintain not just one model, but a set of models that work well at different forecasting horizons. Earlier literature also referred to empirical results showing that the term spread and some additional financial variables are valuable leading indicators for a recession, but mostly at longer horizons of 6 to 12 months ahead and beyond. Conversely, at shorter horizons, real variables appear to be more powerful in signaling recessions. And apropos the author's comments in slide 5 regarding the non-robustness of historical statistical relationships relative to structural changes in the economy or economic policy, here are some remarks on distributional non-stationarities and use of robust methods in nowcasting the COVID pandemic. These are a couple of 2020 papers on short-term forecasting of the coronavirus by Dunick, Castle and Hendry, and Huber and others on nowcasting in a pandemic using non-parametric mixed VARs. Huber and co-authors utilize so-called non-parametric adaptive regression models in mixed frequency vector autoregressive models to develop a robust Bayesian approach to macroeconomic nowcasting in a pandemic. Conventional linear mixed frequency VARs nowcast poorly during the pandemic because of their inability to effectively deal with the extreme observations that have occurred. On the other hand, adaptive regression pre-models are more flexible and ideally suited for nowcasting in the face of extreme observations such as those caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Henry and co-authors also have been publishing real-time forecasts of confirmed cases and deaths from COVID-19 since March 2020. These forecasts are short-term statistical extrapolations of past and current data, extracting trends using machine learning, and then computing forecasts that are largely reliable indicators of what to expect in the following week. But forecasting performance deteriorates beyond 1 week. The methodology here is a statistical data-based approach, quicker to produce, runs faster than structural models, but does not estimate structural parameters. On the other hand, structural models that are based on well-established theoretical underpinnings supported by available evidence are crucial for viable policymaking in disciplines based on observational data, like economics and other social sciences. But economics has a long history of employing relatively simple data-based devices for outforecasting formal structural models, because shifts in the distributions of variables from their past behavior lead to systematic misforecasting in a wide variety of commonly used models, ranging from regression to scalar and vector autoregressive models and volatility models such as ARTS and GARTS. And the authors further surmise that combining their non-theoretical approach with structural modeling may be a fruitful avenue for future research. In conclusion, let me echo my introductory summary remarks that in general agreement with I am in general agreement with Dr. Sahm's call to use real-time tracking in forecasting future regression and responsive policy making. At the same time, one should also emphasize the need to pinpoint concretely what is involved in real-time tracking and cover details of its implementation. My discussion here underscores the proposition that there is a great deal of complementarity between effective real-time tracking, as I tend to interpret it in terms of nowcasting, and macroeconomic financial modeling and forecasting that incorporates economic and non-economic causes of a recession, utilizes contemporary advances in economic theoretic modeling, non-standard real data, data science, and econometric methods. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk again. Thanks, Sid.
Thank you very much, Professor Mariano. And before we take questions from the group, Claudia, would you like to respond, offer some comments to Dr. Mariano's thoughts and insights?
Yeah, so I very much appreciate all those comments and absolutely agree with them. I think one thing that I think to set in context that the type of forecasting I did and the way the board approaches it, so it's very much an all in, right? So we do have DSGE models, kind of the like the workhorse kind of new Keynesian type model, so like really historical relationships. We have a whole suite of nowcasting models that are very much in the spirit of the factor analysis, the mixed frequencies. The part of the forecast that I worked on was what we often referred to as the judgmental forecast. So we started with some basic statistical relationships, so running models. Like I worked on consumer spending. There are, patterns between income and spending and savings, wealth in the mix. And so we would start with that basic framework. And then in the piece I was working on, like there was this real tracking of data, not in the sense necessarily that we could just put it in the model and it would spit out a number, but it was one part of the forecast where we were trying to open up the black box, right? And so that was where this like tracking of specific data, it was you had a story, an idea of the like what was happening in the economy. Then you'd go look at it more in like granular data or in particular types of data, and then go back to the statistical model and judgmentally do adjustments. But obviously that's not that's more time intensive. That gets very data specific. You can go down the wrong rabbit hole with that kind of analysis. But I think this is just one to emphasize the point that we need to develop a large toolkit, different kinds of statistical model, different kinds of approaches, and then the challenge, and this is one where I don't, have no one has the perfect answer to this, is you get in a place where it's really about choosing the right model or how to use them in conjunction. A critique that was often heard with the financial crisis, as you had the Queen Elizabeth quote, that the economists didn't predict it, right? And then we hear, well, the models didn't have financial channels. Well, that's actually not true. There were models that we'd had for decades that did have a very serious modeling of financial transmission mechanisms. They just weren't the ones we were using, right? So we do have to, in addition to developing all these tools, there is this learning. That's why we, have a part of the forecast that's the judgment. Like we have all these tools, we have all this information. You got to pull it together, but that's hard, and that's something that is very resource intensive, and there's no one size fits all to it. So I think that's the one response I'd have to that. But yeah, we've got a lot of tools, a lot of statistical tools. We do have a lot of knowledge about how the economy works. You just bring it all together.
Thank you, Claudia. We can now take questions and comments from our participants. You may use the chat box, or you can raise your hand virtually, of course, so that you can be unmuted. We would appreciate it if you can state your name and also your affiliation. No one raising their hand at the moment, so I read the question coming from the chat box from Professor Gate, Professor of Economics at the Indian Statistical Institute, and I read a very interesting presentation. Raj Chetty at Harvard and Eric Hurst at Chicago have been gathering a lot of high frequency data, real-time data for tracking, especially during the pandemic in the US. This is much harder to do in emerging market economies. Do you suggest that central banks tie up with private data agencies in conjunction with statistics ministries to build these kinds of high frequency databases? There's actually a follow-up question, related question to that. For the US and coming from Jed Santo Domingo of the BSP Research Academy, for the US and other advanced economies, the unemployment rate may be a leading or advanced indicator. But for other countries, such as most emerging economies, the unemployment rate can be a lagging indicator. As such, would some version of the SAM rule be a useful warning device, tool for signaling recession and the need for fiscal stimulus?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question because it's a little simpler and go to the first. So in the United States, the unemployment rate is a lagging indicator, right? Typically, it will peak well into and sometimes after the recession has ended. What the recession indicator looks at are these small changes, right? So the current unemployment rate relative to the past 12 months in the United States is also the case in Canada. An increase of a 0.5 percentage point, you're in a recession, in the early months using the National Bureau of Economic Research, which after the fact says when a recession in the US begins. So it's not that you have to have a big increase in the unemployment rate to start with, you have to have a small one. Now, to your point though, there is absolutely no reason that that relationship has to work in other countries, particularly if you think of a global recession. That was not so much the case this time, but in like 2008, the global recession was very much caused by imbalances in the US economy and the US financial markets, right? So it's like the way disruptions transmit from one country to another can very much affect what those conditions would look like. Now, what I would encourage is loss of jobs, loss of income. Like this is by and large, this is the reason that recessions are so damaging, because they are so harmful to families, small business owners. So it's not that like the unemployment rate has to be the measure, and it may absolutely not have the same properties, but they're it's worth, I think, focusing on labor market conditions and seeing if there's something there. And I guess bigger picture, the what's now called the Sahm rule was honestly just a side output of the project I was working on for automatic stabilizers, right? Like how to prepare policy better for the next recession. If you want to do that, you have to have something to trigger it to start the programs. And it's not, what that is could very much differ between between countries and context. So I absolutely don't want to say this is going to work in other countries, but it is worth thinking about, and it could very well be that across emerging markets there are patterns that are more common than in developed countries. And it's also institution specific, like what labor markets look like in recessions. But I think it's worth investigating those. On the question about developing big data in other countries. So I worked on one of the big data projects at the Fed. I mean, this was an expensive project, right? So it's about access to data. It's also about resources to create data sets. And private company data is not collected. It is not created with the intention of making statistics. And so even in the United States, there is a wide range of quality in those statistics. So bad information is probably worse than no information, right? Because you can get a lot, you can be very much misled. So there's that piece of, it does take a lot to invest, and every country or every private company will have different ways that they're creating data. So there is that issue. And then I will say for government agencies, one of the challenges, and I was part of a larger project across different statistical agencies in the United States, is, private companies can come and go. Private companies will put restrictions on data. The costs, the contracts could change. Most government agencies, official statistical agencies, need continuity. And that's very difficult. And the other thing, the thing we do very much benefit in our traditional forecasting models is we have long time series. The big data projects, what we had done at the Fed, we had no business cycle, right? The big data really started coming after the Great Recession. And so then this whole, like, we're going to forecast a recession, we don't have the data. So I think, there are probably smaller, well, I mean, this is where data are going. These private sector collaborations, I do think there's probably a lot that all of you just starting can learn from the experiences that have already been put into the big data. We certainly had several failed attempts at finding a private company, finding the methods. But yeah, I fully understand, like, the resources, the partnerships are hard to create, but there are real payoffs to having that kind of timely, granular data.
Thank you, Claudia. There's also the question about revisions in data. From time to time, the revisions in data can be significant, including for high frequency indicators. And so what is the risk that the revised data could reverse the policy imperatives? I think this question can be also leveled to Dr. Mariano as well.
Do you want to take that to start with, Dr.
I
Mariano?
can start by saying, in terms of data revisions, it is very true that data revisions can, especially in the national income accounts in a country like the Philippines, can change in a very significant way the information that's coming out, relevant information. And so there is conceivably enough historical information to establish some systematic patterns in the way the revisions are happening, so that you could also anticipate, based on these statistical relationships, what might happen in the future, given what you're seeing as preliminary data and so on. But
Yeah.
in the spirit of the question, it is very important to take into account the fact that revisions are going to be changing. Claudia?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, and I would say, I mean, as a forecaster, I would joke that what's most heartbreaking is what you thought you knew, but you didn't, right? So you're always waiting for the next data point, but a lot of times when you get that, you learn that the data you got last month was not the right data. I mean, that it revised. I will say one of the things that the Fed with the big data projects, and there is a labor market one and there was a retail sales one, is this idea of bringing together data that are created independently, right? The national accounts data in the United States is like the best data that we have. It has a very sound statistical method to it, and yet it's measured with error too, and it is subject to revisions, right? And so some of our projects, we're not trying to just mimic it. That data exists. You create from a different data source. You make sure they're basic property. I mean, like, we're looking at the same economy when you're doing it. But one thing that we found with our retail sales series was that we could actually use it to predict revisions to the census retail sales data. So it wasn't that our data are necessarily better. It's just like we got our information more quickly, and it just happened the way those other data were constructed, that on average we were able to predict revisions. And if nothing else, it would give us another data point. So if retail sales dropped off 1 month, and sometimes that's just noise and it will jump back, but then if our other data set was like, no, it's pretty solid, so it would give us another piece of information that I think potentially softened the blow of revisions. But I mean, this is the reality of doing policy making in the moment. Like, the dust has not settled. The picture will almost certainly change. You just want to make sure that qualitatively, like, you're getting the right signal. And I will say, I mean, relating a little bit to the Sahm rule and these, like, creating triggers that just go on autopilot, that is, I mean, I spent a lot of time making sure that didn't have false positives, being conservative in what that cutoff was, because if you're going to just kick off policy, you do need to feel very confident that it has backing. Of course, historical relationships can change, right? So yeah, revisions are a real thing, and measurement error and problems, those are not going away. That's true.
Thank you, Claudia. Here's an interesting question, again from the academy. To what extent would a guaranteed automated loose policy fiscal action paradoxically drive the risk-taking that would lead to instability sought to be addressed in the first place, the moral hazard issues? Where there's the notion of insurance, there may be more risk-taking. Comments on this particular point, please?
So this critique, this concern can show up in a lot of, I mean, I think the place, so we don't have to do this counterfactually, right? When you think about in central banking, so a big role for the reason we have the Federal Reserve, the reason we have many central banks is as a lender of last resort, right? And we saw the Federal Reserve step in when financial markets completely started melting down in March, and they made sure that liquidity was pumped out into financial markets. There has been a big discussion since the great financial crisis, which was a time the Fed stepped in a lot, that this was causing this exact problem, that banks or financial firms would know the Fed would be there, so they didn't have to have their own buffers. Now, the way that problem has been solved the way to address that is not to say the Fed won't be the lender of last resort. I mean, we do need financial markets, right? And things will happen. I mean, the pandemic was an example, maybe even a better example, in that this was no one's fault. Like, this was not about a mortgage market imbalance. This was about a global pandemic. So then what you can do, and what in the United States with Dodd-Frank and other regulations, is you have financial institutions prepare themselves better with capital buffers and the like. So switching into this automatic stabilizer, the way to address this, just in terms of human costs, cannot be, let's not have a safety net, or let's have a really weak safety net so people have to save. Like, that's just not that's just not the goal of policy. And frankly, in the United States, and this is true, I mean, in countries across the world, there are families and individuals in the economy that simply do not have the means to self-insure, right? So they just don't have the income to save up ahead of time. But the stronger your automatic stabilizers are, the stronger your safety net is, it will change behaviors outside of recessions. So I acknowledge the point. I just think that the way that we try to mitigate those potential problems should not be in weakening the support we give in recessions. It should be about strengthening outside of recessions, whether it's labor markets for individuals or it's capital requirements for banks.
Thank you, Claudia. We have time for one more question. Actually, it's a commentary and related questions coming from a researcher from an economist from the Research Academy. And I read, as Dr. Sahm mentioned, monetary policy needs forecasts way in advance of the first signs of the crisis happening, due to its very nature, that it impacts on real variables with long and variable lags. So we are still down to the need to improve more longer-term forecasting methods, in addition to nowcasts and the tracking of information, to help signal prices within acceptable levels of accuracy. So again, the use of a suite of models rather than being reliant on one particular model. Dashboards and heat maps are very helpful as well, but they too require a lot of discretion on how it is to be used for policy decision making. How exactly can one summarize or combine the compilation of tracking information into a forecast?
Yeah. So though I'll say the approach that we take at the Fed, I mean, this is, I mean, we talked about it before. You can have all of these models, you can have all of this data, you have to be able to roll it up. I think the way that we approach this at the Fed as a staff is to be able to put a narrative together, right? Like, there are numbers, but at the end of the day, we have to step back and think about the economics. Like, what are the factors underlying the forecast? Because statistical models are not, like, in the moment to know that 3 is the right number, that 2 is the right, like you, again, you can go into the black box and have a hard time making those, like being able to distinguish those. They're really, I mean, again, there is no magic bullet to this. And yet, so the approach we have as a staff is to create a narrative that tries to tell the story of what factors, like what is actually driving, we think, like phenomenon in the world. And then at the end of the day, I mean, it's the policymaker that's going to make the decision. I mean, monetary policy is not on a preset course. Fiscal policy, even if you have some stronger automatic stabilizers, there's always measures that need to be taken specific to the recession. So that's the way that I mean, that's the kind of work I did as a forecaster, was trying to build that narrative from various models. I don't think you're going to find a statistical method to do that work for you. I do think at the end of the day, there's judgment that has to be involved. And that's purely, I mean, that's a human capital of forecasters. That's not just a statistical modeling advance. So I don't know, but I should pass that one over too and see if you have other ideas.
That's a real big question, and that's actually the question that I was raising in my comments. I mean, it's pretty well documented that we do need a battery of models, or not just one, but and the question is, how do you optimally utilize this mix of models after you've decided on which ones they are? And I think Claudia's point too is well made, that you cannot just be purely statistical, and you have to be partly judgmental as well. And that's a big research agenda that's worth getting into, digging into.
I would think, if I can say so, that this has been a very insightful discussion on forecasting a future crisis. I think humility, as Claudia has often said, is the operative word, and complementarity as well. So we are very mindful that we should understand and accept the extent of future uncertainty against which policy decisions can be made. On this particular subject of automatic stabilizers, the issues of timeliness, when to give the relief, magnitude, how large the relief, duration, how long to give the relief, will continue to be guided by the complementary ingredients of economic forecast, data, model, and judgment. We want to forecast because we want to plan, not precise plans for single events, but contingency plans or scenarios for classes of events. So it is not so much aiming at predicting a future precise quantitative number, but a range of scenarios that might occur based on differing policy choices, so that we can develop strategies that could mitigate, if not neutralize, sources of threats. So our sincerest thanks to Claudia Sahm, Dr. Sahm, Dr. Mariano, and all who tuned in and actively participated in this session of the conference. To everyone, please continue to take extra care and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Governor Amador, Dr. Sahm, and Dr. Mariano. To our participants, our next session will be 5 hours from now, or at 3 p.m. Manila time. See you then.